Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden. And, last episode was really fun because we were talking about this Varsity Blues scandal and Caitlin Flanagan just popped by up the top of the show, had a kind of virtual drink with me. And I thought that was really fun. And then lo and behold, for this episode, where we're going to talk about an extraordinary personal story of a Lithuanian woman who discovered that her grandfather, who was heroically celebrated and continues to be heroically celebrated in Lithuania, turned out to be quite a war criminal. And her story is about uncovering that as a journalist. But that being said, so having a drink with me up the top, and I couldn't think of anyone better to put this in perspective, is Anne Applebaum, Pulitzer-Prize winning historian, expert on Eastern European history, gulags, etc. Just just when I need an expert on this stuff, I just go Anne, can you just stop by and let's talk about war criminals?
Sure, I'm always available to talk about war criminals.
Well, one of the things that I found very interesting about this story, and our guest is, her name is Silvia Foti, and she's author of The Nazi's Granddaughter, How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal, was she had grown up in this Lithuanian community in Chicago. She didn't even really know there was a Holocaust, at least in Lithuania. Of course, she knew of the Holocaust. And then she went on this discovery. But one of the things she encounters that I'll talk to her about is this kind of wall of resistance from the Lithuanian government, not wanting to acknowledge what happened in Lithuania and the Lithuanians' own culpability and guilt in rounding up and murdering Jews, basically.
So there are several reasons for that. One is the natural reason that no country likes to feel culpable of anything. All countries like to think of themselves as great, and there really aren't any exceptions to that. But there are a few specificities of wartime Lithuania that are worth knowing about. One of them is that right before the Nazi invasion of Lithuania, which I think is what your guest speaks about.
Right. They were occupied by the Soviets from 1940 to 41.
Right. So they were occupied by the Soviet Union, but that was an extraordinarily brutal occupation. Mm-hmm. Something like a third, it depends a little bit how you count, of all Lithuanians were deported to Siberia. And that was really all of the national elite, the whole government, the police force, the teachers. The Soviet idea was to kind of decapitate the country and remove anyone with education or leadership and put them some of them were in concentration camps and some of them were put in exile villages. And many didn't return, or many returned many years later, but it was a really destructive move in what's of course a very tiny country. And that meant that by the time the Nazis arrived, you had really a country, there wasn't really a country there. The state had been completely disintegrated. There was no authority. Nobody was in charge. I mean, it was a real state of nature. And the most brutal and violent people were the people who immediately rose to the top, because there was simply the structures of society had been totally destroyed by that point. And this is a really important thing to understand about all these countries that were subjected to these, sometimes 2 or 3 occupations in this period. So when judging them, remember where they started. This was already this moment of extreme brutality. That's not to excuse anybody. It's just to explain how it was possible and why there wasn't more resistance. I mean, the people who would have resisted were gone already by that time, or they were dead, or they were deported. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a thing that happened after the war, which is that the suffering of these countries, and that includes the Baltic states, includes Poland, includes other East European states. Some of these countries feel that their war experience, their population that was murdered, their people who were sent to Siberia or to Auschwitz, or to other camps, because they were, of course, sent to German camps alongside Jews, that their experience wasn't recognized. And somehow the world knows about the Holocaust, but they don't know what happened to Lithuania. And this is where you can often get these very angry, nationalist sounding rhetoric about what about us? What about our suffering? Why don't you care about us? And sometimes that goes along with this refusal to recognize or acknowledge to a degree that the outside world feels would be appropriate what happened to the Jews. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not making an excuse. I'm just explaining, why one of the reasons why there might have been that kind of resistance. And by the way, I should also say that there would be lots of Lithuanians who would know a lot about the Holocaust, and they're Lithuanian scholars of the Holocaust. And so it's not a universal view, but she might well have encountered that kind of resistance when she was doing her research.
Well, before the Soviet Union occupied Lithuania, it had this brief flourishing moment of being independent,
right?
Like 20 or 22 years.
Right. But between the First World War and the Second World War.
Exactly. And then her grandfather was in the Lithuanian army, and he was this big patriot for a free Lithuania. And I think actively worked against the communist occupation. But then when the Germans came along, he felt, according to her book, that there was maybe greater hope that if you collaborated with Germany, there would be a free Lithuania. On the other hand, there is this underlying theme that, and in a free Lithuania, wouldn't it be nice to have it without Jews? Well, there was such incredible, what we would now call othering, but anti-Semitism, and that these people aren't real Lithuanians. They occupy too much power, too much money, and we need to eradicate them for a pure Lithuania.
Well, this was what Hitler was offering to people. So Hitler was an ethnic nationalist, and it was Germany for the Germans, and the Germans are superior to others. But he implied to other countries and to smaller countries that we could also have a France for the French, and we could have a Lithuania for the Lithuanians, and that we would all somehow live together in this kind of ethnically pure Europe. And that was part of his language. That was he seemed to be offering people. And there were other countries where there was even more collaboration with Germany for the same reason. I mean, Hungarian collaboration with Hitler was almost entirely to do with the fact that the Hungarians thought that if they did that, they would get their ancestral Hungarian-speaking lands back that they'd lost after the First World War. So there were lots of people in Europe who saw this as a way of regaining some kind of national status, and the Jews were seen as some kind of force against that,
or interlopers, or not real
interlopers.
Citizens.
They weren't real Lithuanians, and another piece of this, and this is both, this is also deep, profoundly unfair in lots of ways, but it was often the case that the Lithuanians would have associated the Jews with the communists,
right.
And
they had been a lot of,
and there is some, and again, this is a really, really hard piece of history to sort out, because you can find instances of, Jews in Lithuania who collaborated with the Soviets when they came in. You can also, I'm sure, find instances of Jews who resisted, but the nationalists would latch on to to those few examples and make a great deal of a very similar dynamic in Poland, actually, and it got even worse after the war, when there were some Jews among the Polish communists, and therefore many Poles describe the Polish Communist Party as Jewish, even though by far, numerically, there's, the Jews are way outnumbered by ethnic Poles. But this element was somehow mixed into all the anger as well.
One of the things that I find lingering is this idea of historical memory that you understand, like, yeah, we suffered too, and and assertions, and it's totally understandable. But then there's something, it's like the South and taking Southern pride in the Confederacy, even though no, it did wrong things and suppressed the Black. And there's something I wonder about this also, this, if not denial, not giving credibility to really what happened in history, because in the end, there are a lot of people whose relatives, ancestors are culpable. And there are a lot of people who may still think, yeah, okay, maybe they shouldn't have taken the Jews out and shot them into ditches, but we're glad not to have the Jews.
Right. And there are aspects of that too. And again, this is a very, very small country. Yep. Very small country. Not very many people speak the Lithuanian language. Yep. The people who feel themselves to be proud Lithuanians. I mean, and believe me, there are lots of cosmopolitan European outward-looking Lithuanians who don't follow this rule at all. But there are also some who feel that smallness as a kind of, we're constantly under danger, we're constantly oppressed. Can't we just have this little space of earth for us? And we don't want to hear any criticism, about us, or we don't even want to do any self-criticism because there's so few of us. We just need to stick together and, be Lithuanian together, something like that. I mean, but even you get that in larger countries too.
Right. Well, that is a phenomenal perspective. You know what I always forget to do when you come on the show is mention that we did this Polish cookbook together. And it does not have gruel in it. There is no recipe for gruel, but it's called From a Polish Country House Kitchen. And we did this together and it was magical.
We did it. And there's also a famous Lithuanian recipe in it. So there are a couple of them. There's actually, there's a Polish summer soup. Okay, which is a cold beetroot soup. Chodnik. Which is in Polish, it's called Chodnik Litewski, so Lithuanian. I don't know whether that's really where it comes from.
Well, Silvia actually makes this soup in one of the scenes, actually with a Jewish guide who takes her around and reveals the actual Holocaust to her in Lithuania. And apparently, we use fresh beets, which is delicious. We roast them. She uses pickled beets,
right?
She claims is much better. And then they did a kind of cook-off and her pickled beets won. So I'm wondering if we should look back,
try it again,
revise history, look back. Again. We were wrong. We were mistaken about the beets.
So I don't think anybody in Poland would make chodnik with pickled beets, but maybe in Lithuania they do. Maybe that's the deep difference between those two cultures.
Kind of keen to try it this summer. Anyway, Anne, thank you so much for stopping by. Enjoy your glass of red wine. Such a joy. And I just should mention that you're on this side of the Atlantic for once, not in Poland, not in England, but in the United States of America.
Very briefly, yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I'm so grateful to Anne for popping by for a glass of wine and giving us that great historical scene setter for our interview with Silvia. Just a heads up, after the interview, our wonderful intern Kai will join me for the March listener reaction. And next week, we'll take a short spring break before resuming the pod in April. And just a reminder, if you enjoy these conversations and the podcast in general, we really do rely on our subscribers in addition to our advertisers to stay afloat. So please, please consider supporting the Femsplainers in whatever way you can. Going to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Femsplainers. And hey, it's not for nothing. We don't mind being friends with benefits because in addition to keeping the podcast going, you'll receive an exclusive bonus monthly episode in which you get to ask our guests questions. And you'll also get our monthly behind the scenes newsletter and invitations to our monthly subscriber-only cocktail party. And for $10 a month or more, you'll receive the weekly podcast in advance and ad-free. It's a wonderful community, and I hope you'll consider joining it, and really for whatever you can afford. Sign up now and get a 10% discount on annual subscriptions. Now, on with the show, right after this message from a sponsor. Last year showed us that you never know what life is going to throw at you. And if you use credit cards to pay for unexpected expenses, it can be overwhelming to manage that debt. Take control with Upstart so you know exactly what to expect. Upstart is the fast and easy way to get a personal loan to pay off your debt, all online. Whether it's paying off credit cards, consolidating high-interest debt, or funding personal expenses, over 500,000 people have used Upstart to get a simple, fixed monthly payment. Upstart finds smarter rates with trusted partners because they assess more than just your credit score. With a 5-minute online rate check, you can see your rate upfront for loans from $1,000 to $50,000. You can get approved the same day and can receive funds as fast as one business day. So if debt is taking over your life, it's time to get a fresh start with Upstart. Find out how Upstart can lower your monthly payments today when you go to upstart.com/femsplain. That's upstart.com/femsplain. Don't forget to use our URL to let them know we sent you. Loan amounts will be determined based on your credit income and certain other information provided in your loan application. So go to upstart.com/femsplain and start taking control of your debt. Silvia, welcome to the Femsplainers.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, some of us think we have, pretty embarrassing relatives. You made quite a discovery, and I just want to hear from the beginning. What was your grandfather's reputation to you all through your childhood and growing up in your, American/Chicago Lithuanian community?
Well, I was born in the 60s and grew up only speaking Lithuanian with my parents. They only had Lithuanian friends. I had only Lithuanian friends. My mom was very proud that I went to kindergarten not speaking a word of English. Like this was a badge of honor. She would show me off. Look, she can't speak a word of English. And I heard a lot of stories about my grandfather, as a young child, and then as I grew older. But essentially, he died at the age of 36 fighting for Lithuania's freedom. And he died in a KGB prison.
This was 1946, correct? A year after the World War II had ended?
He died in 1947.
Right.
And, but he was 36 years old. And he had been tortured in this KGB prison for over a year by the terrible communists. And they captured him because he was trying to fight for Lithuania's freedom against the communists. Before that, he was in a Nazi concentration camp for almost 2 years. And the story I had heard was that, or I was led to believe that he was in a Nazi concentration camp because he helped save Jews. Before that, he led a rebellion against the communists in 1941 in northwestern part of Lithuania. So he fought twice against the communists. The first time they won, and the second time they lost. And he also lost his life.
Right. So in Lithuania, the Soviet communists invade in 1940. Then they're driven out in 1941, which your grandfather was a part of that. And then minutes later, as it were, the Nazis come in, take Germany, and it is then liberated, so to speak, by the Soviets in 1945, I guess, right?
Right.
So here is your heroic grandfather fighting against all sides of tyranny and occupation for his beloved Lithuania's independence. And in your household outside of Chicago, you had, of course, your mother and father, and then your grandmother, who was his widow, and she had fled with your mother from Lithuania towards the end of the Second World War and got to America. And his reputation, the way you described it, just loomed so large over your household. I mean, it wasn't just like occasionally you would talk about your grandfather, the hero. It was, I mean, it kind of even affected, as you wrote, your mother's marriage to your father.
Yeah, I mean, he was always a presence in the house, like literally just a ghost that we would always refer to. If I would do something, my mom or my grandmother would be, what would your grandfather think? And I would be mortified if I did something wrong that my grandfather would not like, even though I had never met him. So he was always invoked for one thing or another. And, for Christmas, he wrote this last letter to my mother on Christmas Eve from the KGB prison. And occasionally my mom would actually read the last letter that he wrote to her, and everybody would be crying at the table. And Lithuanians have a tradition of leaving a plate for someone deceased at the table. So there would always be an empty plate for him. So he was always around.
And it's so much so that the worship towards him expressed by your mother and grandfather kind of got under your dad's skin, like, oh, we're never going to live up to that guy's, reputation. No male in this household.
I think so. I think my father had an inferiority complex next to my, legendary, mythical, heroic grandfather. He was just never going to live up to that.
And it was also true in the Lithuanian community. You were a little bit like royalty, that it wasn't just his reputation within your own family, but in your community, and of course, in Lithuania itself. Do you want to just describe how large he loomed outside of your household?
Yeah, like I would, there were all, in Chicago, in the Lithuanian community, there was one event after another to go to. And so there were like concerts and parties and political things. And so I would go, with my parents, and my mom would always be like, look, here's the granddaughter of Jonas Noreika, and everybody would be oohing and eyeing. And I, so I got a lot of that. And then, in 1997, my mom, Lithuania finally got its independence again in 1990 from the Soviet Union. And then my mom went to Lithuania almost every year after that, collecting material for her book that she was going to write about her father. And then in 1997, she was invited to come to get the Cross of the Vytis, which is the highest honor you could get posthumously for her father. Mm-hmm. And the president at the time, President Algirdas Brazauskas, gave it to her. And I was on one side of her, and my brother, who's now in California, was on the other side of her. We were all invited to get this big honor on behalf of our grandfather.
And you were just busting with pride, because there are I think plaques to him throughout the country, and you just mentioned the name, and hero of the Republic.
Yes, so he's got a school named after him. He's got plaques on buildings. One is in Vilnius, very prominent building. Streets named after him. Like these rocks, monuments with like plaques inside of them, wherever his foot might have touched, So, very well known.
And your mother, who was an opera singer, she sounded actually really interesting. But she, as you said, she'd spent what, like 30 or 40 years just amassing documents to write the definitive, and we assume heroic story, but she never, ever got to finishing it. And then describe how the task fell to you.
Yeah. So I grew up always watching her, say she's working on this story on her father. And we would talk about it a lot, in the 90s. We would talk about it a lot. And then in the year 2000, she was only 6 years old. She landed in the hospital again, and she had diabetes and a bad back. And so she was in and out of the hospital a lot for one test or another, one treatment or another. And she always came out, And so we kind of got used to this. And so she had been called to the hospital again. And I went to visit her, but she did look really, really bad this time. And she calls me over to her bed, and she says, you have to write the book. And of course I knew which book it was. But I was mostly devastated over her saying this, because she would never say this unless she thought she was dying. And she had, this is a project that she wasn't going to finish, and it had to get done in her mind. And I had been a journalist at that time. And so she talked about him all the time with me. And so she asked me to write it. And when your mom is in that state, there's only one thing you can say to her. So I said yes. And when I came back the next day, she was in a coma. And then that was it. In 2 weeks, she had died.
Yeah, and your grandmother died just a few months later, and you were left with this deathbed promise that, knowing how many thousands of pages of documents and how large the task had loomed over her, you were now, I guess, in your opinion, sort of stuck with writing it. And then your grandmother on her deathbed, you told her this, and what did she say?
Well, she says, Sylvia, how's the book going? And I thought she really wanted it written. And I said, it's fine. At the time I was 38, I'm young. I'm going to get it done. I'm not going to let it go like Mom did. And I thought I was giving her words of comfort. And she says, don't write the book. And I said, what? And she said, just let history lie. I'm like, what? Mm-hmm. And I said, I promise, Mom, of course I have to write the book. And she said, there's no need to dig around. And I said, I have to. This is a very important story, and this was Mom's last wish. And she did not like my answer. So she essentially turned to face the wall. She was in bed, and I thought, okay, I guess I'll come back another day. And then the next time I saw her, she was in a coma, and then she had died.
So you never, in all of their lifetimes, you never heard them indicate there was anything other than this illustrious history to your grandfather?
No, I was completely kept in the dark. And I didn't even know about the Holocaust in Lithuania. That's how ignorant I was. I knew about...
Did they ever express views on Jews, or did Jews ever do you remember having any memories or opinions of Jews or that they might have mentioned? They
were usually not favorable.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of remember watching the Holocaust on TV, and my mom was like, it's always about the Holocaust. Why is it the Holocaust? What about the poor Lithuanians who were sent to Siberia? Why don't they do a movie on that?
Yeah.
So it was kind of like that.
Yes. All right. So now tell us the first indications you got that all was not as it seemed.
Well, my mom and my grandmother both wanted to be buried in Lithuania. That's how much they loved that country. And they were cremated. And so my brother and I took their cremains to Lithuania, had another funeral there. And then after that, my brother and I were invited to visit the school after my grandfather. And it's the Jonas Noreika Grammar School in Šukioniai, which is northern town. And we're greeted very grandly by the children who are holding flowers and singing Lithuanian songs. And the director, before noon, and the director's giving us a mug of beer. And if you're Lithuanian, of course, you're drinking it. And then he ushers us into his office, and teachers are standing around there. And he takes me to a scrapbook of our grandfather, and just article after article after article collected about his heroism. And he says, I heard you're writing the book about your grandfather, that you took the project over from your mother. And I said, yes. And he said, you're such a good daughter for doing that. And I said, thank you. And I said, as long as I'm here, maybe I could do a little research and just ask you how you named the school after my grandfather. I had never heard the story. And he said, well, Lithuania got its independence in 1990. And so shortly after that, we wanted to get rid of that horrible Russian name we had. And we wanted to get a good patriotic Lithuanian name. And so it didn't take long for us to agree on your grandfather, because he was born in this town. And he's such a magnificent hero and wonderful legend. It seemed like a natural. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then he takes me to the side and he says, but I got a lot of grief over naming this school after your grandfather. And I said, grief from who? And he says, from the Jews. And I said, what could the Jews possibly say about my grandfather? And he looked at me like I'm the idiot for not knowing this. And he says he was accused of killing Jews. And he said it so matter-of-factly, like, and then the shock of it, I almost fainted. It was a punch in the gut, and I had to sit down. And this is the first time I heard it. And then he says, he could see I'm upset. And he says, but it's all in the past. That's ancient history. It doesn't mean anything. And besides, it's just communist propaganda. It's not true. So that's how I first heard it.
And then a penny dropped. But as you, what I love about your book, it is as much a story of a journalist pursuing a story, however reluctantly, as well as you as this descendant coming to your own realization of the truth. And you decided to take some time, like a couple months this summer, to come back. And this is now, 10 years after you worked on this book for a number of years over the summers. And you decided to take some time in Lithuania and really try and uncover the story.
Yeah. So when I first heard that, what I called the rumor for a long time, it was in the year 2000, in October 2000. And it took me I was like every Lithuanian. I stayed in denial over it, believing also that it was communist propaganda, because I think that's a good story. That is much easier to believe than, that your grandfather was a Holocaust perpetrator. I mean, that's horrible. And so, but as I started doing my research, and at the time I was a journalist and, 2 young children, and this was completely a side project. So I worked at it very, very slowly. And I didn't really understand his whole heroic side. So I thought I would tackle that first and then hit the rumor, later. And then in the meantime, I could kind of emotionally face it. And so, I changed my career. I became a high school teacher so I could have my summers off to work on this. And then I was getting so many rejections from literary agents that I decided I had to approach this in a completely different way. And I decided to get an MFA in creative nonfiction to write it. So when my professors there let me use this as my thesis. And they're the ones who basically said, you should write this as a memoir. Because I was trying to write it as a third person biography of my grandfather. And they're like, no, this is going to be much better if you are the guide to the story and you let it unfold the way you understand it and tell it that way. And so it took me a long time to even learn how to write memoir style as a journalist. So that was a big thing. And then they said, and by the way, this is all about the Nazi occupation. His heroism's nice. You should definitely cover that. But this is really, the story is the Nazi occupation in Lithuania. Mm-hmm. And so that was, a big thing for me to accept. But I did. And then they said, and you have to go to Lithuania to conduct your research there, because that's the only way you're really going to get at the truth. And so by the time I got my MFA, it was 2013. And the next possible time I could go was the summer. So I went that very summer, 2013, to conduct my research. And then that's what I did. I stayed there for 7 weeks, which is most of my teacher summer, and conducted as much research as I could. And I really, really learned a lot.
And at first you began with your relatives, obviously. And then one of the, you'd also discovered, before this, you discovered some very virulent anti-Semitic tracts that your grandfather had written in your mother's, it was in your mother's research, but you found them of the kind that are very 1930s, just describing Jews as like rodents and how they were buying up everything. I mean, what was the sort of view that you learned that he held even before you knew about any of his actions?
Yeah, so this was my mom was organized, but not like a librarian organized, with all the information she had. So this was kind of tucked away in between things, and I saw it very late, like maybe 8-9 years in. And it was a little brochure that he wrote. It's called "Raise Your Head, Lithuanian," and he wrote it in 1933. He was at the age of 22. And he had just joined the Lithuanian army. He wrote it in Klaipėda, where he was stationed in the Lithuanian army originally. And so when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, this is just going to be like a patriotic thing about how wonderful it is to be Lithuanian or something. And I was unprepared for what I was going to see. And so I started reading it and I'm like, it's basically what you just said. Lithuania is for Lithuanians, not the Jews. The Jews are the foreigners. Don't buy any more products from any more Jews. Only buy from Lithuanians. It's not fair that the Jews have some of the best positions in Lithuania. And it's essentially going on and on like this for 32 pages. And by the time I finished this, as his granddaughter, I wanted to burn the thing. But I knew as a journalist I couldn't. And so that was already a big turning point for me. Then I thought, okay, this really does establish his anti-Semitism at a very young age. He was 22. He did not. What I did tell myself was he didn't call for their murder at that time. So it was just boycotting, which is severe, but it's not murder. And so I still had hope then that maybe I could exonerate him from the Holocaust, but of course I wasn't able to.
Well, one of the very striking parts of your book, so you sort of going from relative to relative, and the very few survivors, one who I will never pronounce their names properly, so I'll let you do that, but who had served with him at the time, starts with a D. What was his name? Now very old and actually quite annoying, as you described him.
Damijonas Rauka.
Right. And he was one of the main continuing people to continue perpetuating this heroic image of your grandfather. And then you connected with a Jewish tour guide. And for the first time, you were shown a map. As you said, you had seen so many maps growing up of Lithuania and all the borders changing, as so many of those Eastern Europe countries did. Like one day Gdansk is in Lithuania, the next day it's back in Poland. They all shift around. But this map showed you a whole bunch of triangles placed where all the Jewish mass graves were. And there were so many, and you were overwhelmed. And then there were a number of them in the area that your grandfather had overseen as a commander. So talk about his role after, or just as the German occupation was happening. What had he been doing just before, and what happened as the Germans entered the country?
So as the Soviet Union came in and took over Lithuania, he was let go from the Lithuanian army. And he was in Kaunas at the time, which was the capital of Lithuania. And he ended up going to Plungė, which was kind of where a lot of my grandmother's relatives were from. And my grandmother was a teacher at the time who taught German. And she ended up getting a job teaching in a one-room schoolhouse on the outskirts of Plungė in this even smaller town called Mordosai. So it turns out that he started, all of Lithuanians were trying to create a rebellion against the Soviet Union and get the country back. And the part of the story that was hidden from me and that I finally put together was that they were working with the Germans to do this, to get Lithuania back from the Soviet Union. And the Germans promised Lithuania independence if they would work together. And of course, that did not work out. But the other part that was hidden for me was that this was the launch of the Holocaust, that this rebellion happened on the exact same day that Operation Barbarossa started, which was June 22nd, 1941. And so as the Germans came in to Lithuania, which was at that time occupied by the Soviet Union, the Lithuanians also joined the Germans to get the communists out. And so my grandfather was in charge of this northwestern part of the country, and his headquarters was in Plungė, and in this area of Žemaitija, which is the lowlands. And so he, and then the capital of the lowlands is Telšiai, and then another very important town is Šiauliai. So he was playing a big role in those three towns, Plungė, Telšiai, and Šiauliai. And in Plungė, right as the Germans and the Lithuanians got rid of the communists, within weeks, 2,000 Jews were murdered. And as it turns out, there were only like 2 Germans in that town. So most of the killing was done by the Lithuanians themselves. And so I was talking to this Damijonas, who was only 17 at the time, but he's the only remaining witness of that rebellion that was working with my grandfather. And he had become a family friend. My mother had relied on him extensively in gathering all of her research. So I knew he would be a really important source. And so I spent a week with him going over what my grandfather did during that time. And he told me in great detail about the whole heroic side of getting rid of the communists and fighting against them. But I kept asking him about, well, what about the Jews? How were all these Jews killed? And he kept saying, well, your grandfather had nothing to do with that. And I'd be like, but he was the leader of the whole Žemaitija during this time. How could he not know what was going on with the killing of the Jews? And he'd be like, well, the men were acting independently. They would just do things without your grandfather knowing. And whenever the Jews were killed, your grandfather was never here. He was in Telšiai usually. So he had no idea that this was happening. And I kept asking him about 100 times, like, until he got sick of it. But I was testing him. I wanted to see what his answer was. And I soon caught on that he's never going to let me know, and that I would have to find out my information in some other way. But I wanted him to say what he said for the record, so to speak, because I wanted this denial to kind of get in my book to show what it's like.
Let's pause the conversation for just a moment so I can tell our listeners about Care Of. Care Of is a wellness brand that makes it easy to maintain your health goals with a customized vitamin plan that helps you feel your best today and supports you long term. All of Care Of's products are formulated with good-for-you clean ingredients that are backed by science. Care Of is super transparent about the research and sourcing behind each one of their products. And Care Of's in-depth 5-minute online quiz asks you questions about your diet, lifestyle, and health concerns to help you address your specific wellness goals. Get a personally tailored approach to your unique health needs. As moms, partners, and business owners, we women have a lot on our plate. Small routines like drinking a glass of water, taking your vitamins, or even adding collagen to your morning coffee can go a long way in helping you prioritize your health and self-care. My doc recommends a daily dose of vitamin D, and through their personal quiz, Care Of has introduced me to other vitamins that are helpful to my specific needs. So for 50% off your first Care Of order, go to takecareof.com and enter Femsplainers50. That's 50% off your first Care Of order. Go to takecareof.com and enter the code Femsplainers50. And as you say, I mean, many of the Jews, if they weren't regarded in this kind of, like, they were not seen as Lithuanians, they were seen as these
Litvaks. They're called Litvaks.
Litvaks. Many did I shouldn't say many, I don't know the number, but many were seen as being more sympathetic to the Russians or the communists. So then, as you note, often they use the term communist interchangeably with the word Jew. And it also gave them more incentive, I guess, in their minds that Jews were to, be dealt with, to be gotten rid of. How did you discover, and also the other thing that was striking is, as you say, the Germans haven't even really arrived to this area except for these two advancement. And the Lithuanians have already gone ahead with zeal to get rid of 2,000 Jews within a matter of weeks. So tell me how you discovered the direct connection between these killings and then how it happened in Lithuania, because it wasn't like in other countries. I mean, it was a little bit like, but there weren't even death camps set up in Lithuania. They were taken care of on the spot, as it were. And it was horrifying.
Yeah. Well, this was where the Holocaust Guide, I got most of this from the Holocaust Guide and Jewish sources. And one thing I noticed was that nowhere in Lithuania, at least at that time, was there a blending of the two stories. There was either like the Lithuanian heroic story or there was the Holocaust, but nobody had really put the two together into one narrative that made sense. So what I discovered was that, the invasion that came June 22nd, 1941, and the 2,000 Jews were killed like July 12, 13. So that's like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And Lithuanians had rounded them up and put them in a synagogue and then essentially stuffed them in a synagogue, and where they had no food, no water, no way to go to the bathroom. Even people died and were just kind of left in there. And they were mocked, and even, some were brought out in the yard and like made fun of and made to dance, kind of as just entertainment for the Lithuanians. And a lot of that I got from Jakobas Bunka, who was a Jew who ended up escaping to the Soviet Union and then coming back and then interviewing whoever he could to find out what happened to the Jews. And so a lot of this was based on his gathering of information. And, one thing then there was another account by this Pakalniškis, who was apparently like the secretary to my grandfather. And he's the one who said that my grandfather gave the orders to kill all the Jews. That Pakalniškis account had been discounted by the Lithuanians. They just decided not to believe him. And then Damijonas would say, well, your grandfather wasn't here. He had nothing to do with it. And then, of course, the end of the book, the end of my journey, my time in Lithuania at the 7 weeks, my aunt, who was in her 80s in 2013, and now she had passed away by now, she's the one who told me that my grandparents had moved into a house that was formerly owned by Jews in the middle of Plungya. And they just appropriated this house and the furniture and everything. And this was a big shock. And then the shock number 2 and 3 is the house is across the street from the police station, and the police station was a Nazi headquarters. So my grandfather was the commandant, at the time. And then shock number 3 is that the house was right next to the synagogue.
Right. And as you said, you could hear people reported hearing cries of children 3-4 blocks away. You could not live next to the synagogue and not know what was going on. You also found some of the orders, the documents that he signed, directing the Jews to be gathered up and put in the synagogue.
No, there were no orders for that. The orders that I found were in the Cholet archives, and he had called for the rounding up. This was after the Plunge thing.
Yeah.
So after July, then he moved to Cholet. So he was only in that Plunge house, that formerly Jewish Plunge house, for like about 6 weeks, I think. And then he moved the whole family to Cholet because he became the chair of the entire Cholet region. The Nazis, well, first the Lithuanian provisional government appointed him, and then the Nazis agreed that he could be the chair. So in August now, 1941, he takes over officially as the division chair of Cholet. And that was where, on August 22nd, 1941, he wrote an order calling for the rounding up of all the Jews and half-Jews of the Cholet region and sending them to a ghetto in Żagadę. And they all had to be rounded up and brought there within 1 week, by August 29th. And then I found another document where the mayor of Żagadę says, we're building the ghetto. Could you please send them some barbed wire and nails so we can create this ghetto? To my grandfather. And then by October, on Yom Kippur, they were murdered. All the 2,000 Jews in Żagadę were murdered.
And they also, your father, I think you have records of him documenting the possessions that were removed. So when they created the ghetto, and this happened in other places, that the people who may have to give up their own homes to be part, so the Jews could be housed in the same urban neighborhood, would then go and occupy the Jewish houses and their furniture. And I think one of the creepiest elements in the book was when you are visiting a couple of your relatives and they have like the walnut sideboard that your father has made a record of. I think he made a list of things that he kept, a chess table that had belonged to these Jews.
Yes, that chess table. You know, he loved to play chess. And I kept hearing stories from relatives of how he would let them win when they were young, but then they figured out that he just let them win. And then I had another relative who said he would play with the Germans on a beautiful chess table. And that chess table was originally in that Jewish house in Plunge. And then he took that chess table, because it was so nice, to where he lived in Cholet. And then after he went to the Nazi concentration camp, and after my grandmother, before she left Lithuania, had to gave a lot of the furniture away. And one of my relatives still has that chess table, and they're very proud of having it. I don't know if they knew that it would belong to Jews, because it's not something anybody would say. But so that's just something I had investigated and discovered.
And how were the Jews in your father's region? How were they killed? I mean,
grandfathers.
I'm sorry, grandfathers. How did it take place? I mean, it took place, as you say, swiftly. But what was their method?
Okay, so the way it was in Plunge is almost the way it was around the whole country. There were around Plunge, there's like 10 or 11 pits. And so the Jews essentially were brought to a location in the forest, far enough away for where their screams couldn't be heard. And so they were asked to dig this big ditch, and then they were asked to strip their clothes and then to stand in front of the ditch. And then Lithuanians would have a rifle and shoot them one by one. And then they would fall into the ditch, and then they would get another round of Jews to throw dirt over that layer of bodies. And then again, they would just do the same thing over and over until that ditch was filled.
And eventually you, by your account, your grandfather oversaw the complete liquidation of Jews from that area of his region. And it amounts to like 5,100. And then they were wiped out through the rest of Lithuania. One of the stories you tell is with this guide who was taking you around in 2013, was it? Sorry. Mm-hmm. You realize, because he was from that area, that your grandfather probably murdered his grandfather and other relatives.
That's because he was from Tel Shay, or his family was from Tel Shay, and Tel Shay was like the capital of that Jemaitiya. And my grandfather traveled between Plunge, Tel Shay, and Shaolei all the time. And so he was kind of the highest Lithuanian during that time. And he's the one probably in charge of administrating how all this could be done and should be done. Now, there's no evidence that he ever shot Jews, and that's a big defense that Lithuanians have, but he never shot any. And somehow they think that exonerates him from any guilt. And I'm like, but he organized the whole, to me, that's even worse. Getting the Jew in front of somebody to shoot them was the hard part, administratively. Like, how do you get them out of their house, bring them, to where they need to be, and then you just get a drunk old Lithuanian to shoot,
Right. In the story, there's just the horrifying stories of, having to tell these groups of Jews that you've herded up in the synagogue that they were going to go. It was like the trick of, oh, you're just going to have a shower at Auschwitz. And they'd get them into a wagon or a truck and then drive them to the forest. And by that point, the Jews figured out what was going on, but it was too late. And so you do document it very thoroughly and conclusively about your grandfather's involvement. As that's happening, and as you accept that that's what happened, how did you feel? How did you feel about finally accepting his role in this?
I went at first through denial, and then I went through depression, and then I finally hit anger. And once I hit anger, I could function again. And that's when I kind of got very resolved, and I said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this if it's the last thing I do. And then I hit shame and embarrassment. Now that the book is out, it's a little cathartic just to finally get it out there. I think this is something Lithuania has been living with for a long time. And I think it's a shock and a trauma for most Lithuanians like me who didn't know this. I think that there are some who are in charge who did know this and are hiding it. But I think most are like me, we didn't know. And
I mean, it is, you talk about the resistance you got, not just from the man who was like the last living witness of what your grandfather did, but the official museum of genocide, that every time you brought it up to somebody who would be in charge of cataloging the nation's history, they would deny it happened.
Yeah, this was the part of the story. Like, it was bad enough to hear about my grandfather and kind of come to terms with that. But then it was like, then it got super political when I was realizing all this. And Simon, the Holocaust guide, he knew more than me.
This was your guide, yeah.
Yeah, and he's the one who talked me into, this was a little bit of a setup for me, but I'm glad he did it. He's the one who talked me into getting an interview with the director of the Genocide Center. And I'm like, there's no way she's going to talk to me. I mean, I'm like this nobody American. He's like, no, you should go. You should do this. And so I was like the reluctant journalist, and he's the one who's pushing me, but he knew why I should do this. And so I finally got the interview with her, and she was very friendly. And I brought up the document that my grandfather signed August 22nd, 1941, Rounding the Jews. It's a primary source document with his signature while he was head of the Shaolei region. To me, this is damaging. And I said, and I asked her about that. And I said, what do you think about that? And her response really floored me, because she said something like, well, we don't really know what was in his heart when he signed this document. We don't really know what he was thinking. And so we have to presume innocence. And I thought, in my journalism training, you don't presume anything in anybody's heart. You just look at what they say and what they write, and their actions speak for themselves. You don't go into their heart unless they say what's in their heart. So this was like opposite thinking for me is in my journalism. And I thought, wow, I am really, somewhere strange. And I wanted to end the conversation because I had all I needed. And Simon just kept pushing and started asking more questions. There is a document, and I did not understand all this until later. This a Jewish man, Melamed, I don't think I even put all this in my book, came up with 20,000 Lithuanians who are implicated in the Holocaust. And in response, the Genocide Center was forced to finally come up with their own list of how many Lithuanians really were involved in the Holocaust. And they came up with a list of 2,000. So only 1/10. And I was not aware of this list, but Simon had asked the director then, what about this list of 2,000 perpetrators? What are you going to do with them? And she said, well, we're worried about what their families are going to think. We can't just release this list and let everybody know about it. I mean, and again, there are no more witnesses and we can't put them on trial. So we have to presume that they're innocent. And when we left that interview, Simon was just spitting bullets. He's like, who cares what their families think? What about the Jews? The Jews are dead.
Right. Once you began publishing this, you did an article for Salon in 2018 saying this. What kind of pushback did you get? I mean, that this denial continues.
Well, it was at that time that I met Grant Goshen. And so he is a Lithuanian American in California of Jewish descent, who lost 100 relatives in the Holocaust in the area where my grandfather was in charge. And so unbeknownst to me, while I was working on my story and my grandfather, he was collecting information also about my grandfather. And he started a lawsuit against the Genocide Center for Holocaust distortion, saying that my grandfather should not be considered a hero and that it's distorting the Holocaust by raising him to the level of a hero and not acknowledging what his role was in killing so many Jews. So when we connected in 2018, it was, I was really stunned that this was happening. And he was stunned that I was, working on my book. And when we compared notes and really started putting our information together, I think we became a very powerful team in talking about this. And so, back to your original question, Grant and I had already connected by then when the Salon article came out, and the pushback in Lithuania was pretty severe. It was all negative against what I had written in Salon.com, publicly, officially. So there were a few people who came out to support what I said, but in general, it was very negative. And then, on Facebook, I would have a lot of negative comments from Lithuanians. I think the ones who supported it just were too scared to come out publicly, and the ones who were against it were very bold and would come out to do that.
Why the reluctance, do you think? I mean, you see this in other countries, especially in Eastern Europe. Now most of those people who participated are dead or about to no longer be with us. As your mother might have said, oh, it happened so long ago. Why not confront the truth?
I think it's a lot of reasons. A lot of it is, it's painful to accept the fact that your ancestors were involved, in the greatest crime of the 20th century, a crime against humanity. And so that's extremely, extremely painful to wrap your head around. So there's just that. Now in Lithuania, and then it was hidden. So it breaks the whole narrative. The narrative of Lithuania is we were just the victims. For us, we were, and it is bad. we were the victims of the communists, and we were victims of the Nazis, and then we were victims of the communists for a whole other 50 years. Like, come on, okay? So what else, do we have to go through? So this is feeling like they're victimized again by being blamed for this. And it's just too much. It's like they've been raised by two abusive parents, the Nazis and the communists. And what do you expect?
And it's not to deny there wasn't terrible suffering and as you know, and deportations to Siberia, and even your dad got tortured by the communists and killed by the communists.
Grandfather.
Why do I keep calling him your father? I'm sorry.
Because I look so old.
No, but you see this, I remember I've been to Hungary and Poland, and you see this there. They have a museum of terror in Hungary, supported by the official government there now, which not a lot about the Jews, much more about the Hungarians, and we suffered. So you can see that it's better to focus on that narrative than things that might have been done. On the other hand, I always wonder if, aside from guilt and shame, there isn't a kind of also thought, well, maybe they went too far with the Jews, but we still don't really like Jews. And maybe the Jews, I think you quote someone saying, maybe the Jews asked for it. Maybe they were too sympathetic with the communists. Like, then there are these other rationalizations that still, in the end, place blame on the Jews for their own extinction.
Yeah, this idea where every Jew is equals a communist cannot be understated. That was the key reason that allowed Lithuanians that gave Lithuanians license to kill Jews, because they were killing the enemy. The problem is, and if it were just military-aged men that they did that to, I don't think we would be here having this discussion, because the genocide is when you get to the children and the babies and the grandparents, anybody who's Jewish. It wasn't just the military-aged men. So, but somehow that's where the anti-Semitism does come in. And that's where they used it as an excuse that all Jews are communists, but then in the end, they're Jews.
Is it? And when you read these stories, in our time, and we didn't live through World War II. It's hard to imagine a time like that, but the unbelievable savagery of these otherwise seemingly civilized, very Christian, compassionate countries. I mean, we all say like this, the Germany was capable of this highly sophisticated country where Jews were very integrated and occupied some of the highest distinctions in academia and the arts, science. And then they can turn and put these same people that they've been living next door to, shove them into these holding pens, and then do unspeakable acts of cruelty. And one of them was your grandfather. How do you wrap your head around it? I get terrified. I have nightmares thinking, if it happened once, what is to say when, a boot gets lifted off, what we're all capable of. But you have this in your direct heritage. What do you say to yourself, or how do you think about this?
I'm a high school teacher. And, as you were speaking, I'm thinking of how I teach Lord of the Flies by William Golding.
Yes. And
that really is just a bunch of innocent boys on an island. And then they end up, really becoming very savage, especially, the one side of the boys. And it's in our human nature, unfortunately. And there is a really horrible dark side that, given license, given the opportunity, we'll take advantage of someone weaker. What stops them from doing it? to me, I don't know. I'm a practicing Catholic, so I always go by the 10 Commandments. That's what helps me. But there's so many people who are not religious anymore. So they have another set of standards to follow. It's very frightening. It is very frightening. And this is, as a high school teacher, when I teach Lord of the Flies, I teach the Milgram experiment, where this man asked, he set up an experiment. He was Jewish, and he set up an experiment after World War II to test how the Holocaust happened. He wanted to see if this is like just something ordinary people would do. Are you familiar with this experiment?
Yes. Go on. Yeah.
So he basically rigged a system where he had an actor on one side pretend to scream in pain, and then he hired people. I think he paid him, something, and he said, "I want you to press this lever, and then when this lever is pressed, and you hear somebody screaming, I want you to continue pressing it, because that's your job." And so. So somebody would press one lever, no screaming, another lever, no screaming. And then he would press it again, there'd be like a little scream. And then he would be coached, continue pressing. And then the actor on the other side would be screaming in agony. And then a lot of the people would continue pressing these levers because they were told to do it.
Yeah.
And so that's when he realized it's not just the Germans. We have it here in America.
Right. And when you have that anti-Semitic culture where you've been taught not to regard these people as human, and even decades later, maybe there are a lot of families who psychically have chess tables in their family, psychic chess tables.
Oh, I know what you mean.
And that they're carrying that around with them, and they don't want to admit the provenance of where that came from.
Yeah, that's all over Europe.
Yeah. Are you now able to let this story go, or what do you do now with this knowledge? And of course, you've written this incredible and very honest and impressive reckoning with your family history. So what do you do with it now?
I only have hopes. My hope is that Lithuania will remove the honors from my grandfather, and I hope that will be the beginning of Lithuania itself coming to terms with what it did with the Holocaust. That's my high hope. I don't know if that will happen, but that's what I'm aiming for.
And are you going to keep on this?
Yeah, as long as I can. This is it. I mean, eventually I'd like to write something else and do something else, but I think this will be part of my life until I die, because it's a big story, and it's a big part. And when I did not realize until 2018 when I met Grant how big it is.
Right.
I thought it was just my grandfather, and then Grant told me that he's got like 10 names from Lithuania that he's working on. And then it's like more and more. And then, it's not just Lithuania. It's like other countries too. Like this is an issue across Eastern Europe and all the formerly Soviet occupied countries where the Holocaust occurred. Germany dealt with it. So they're the model.
Right. Well, it's extraordinary. And I agree with your teachers who insisted you turn this into a semi-autobiographical story, because, as you say, if you had just written this biography about a man who was well regarded in Lithuania who turned out to be, a war criminal, I think it would have much less general interest, because it would be more academic. It would be more like the reckonings that, as you describe, are going on everywhere. But this incredible personal journey that you've described, and how not just Lithuanians, but so many countries and cultures are implicated in it. And if you don't reckon with it, how do you stop it from happening again? And I think that's what's so profound and important about your book.
Thank you.
Well, Silvia, thank you for joining us. Good luck with this tour that you are on, and
thank you.
I just really thank you for joining us and for what you've done.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Have you ever been in another country and wanted access to your American shows? Or wanted to watch a show only available, say, in the UK or France? Well, you can use ExpressVPN to unlock movies and shows that are only available in other countries. I've used ExpressVPN when I'm up visiting my family in Canada, and I suddenly realize I can't access the movies I want to watch that are in the US because Canada has blocked them. But ExpressVPN lets me change my online location so I can control where I want sites to think I'm located. All you do is you open the app, select a location, tap one button to connect, and refresh the page to access thousands of new shows and movies. And you can choose from almost 100 different countries. You can watch anime on Japanese Netflix, Doctor Who on UK Netflix, Brooklyn Nine-Nine on Canada Netflix. And this works with any streaming service, Hulu, BBC, iPlayer, YouTube. But why choose ExpressVPN over other VPNs? Well, you can stream in HD, no problem, no buffering or lag. It's compatible with all your devices, phones, laptops, media consoles, smart TVs, and more. And not only does it let you change your location, it also encrypts your data and lets you surf the web safely and anonymously. So go to expressvpn.com/femsplain to get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. That's Express, V as in Victor, P as in Peter, N as in Nancy, expressvpn.com/femsplain. Well, that was a remarkable story, and it's impressive that Silvia is trying to compensate and not just come to terms with what her grandfather did, but also compensate by trying to rectify the record. So that takes a lot of courage. Again, her book, it's Silvia Foti, F-O-T-I, and her book is The Nazi's Granddaughter, How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal. And now we're going to completely change topics and go to our month-end listener reaction. We won't be having a podcast next week because we will take a break. So joining me is the amazing Kai Biliucci, official assistant / executive intern to the podcast. Hi, Kai.
Hi, Danielle. Hi, everyone. So this month we had a lot of reactions to Leslie Lair's book, A Boob's Life. We're still getting reactions, which is great. Our first listener had actually asked Caitlin Flanagan and Danielle about whether or not she should get a boob job. And she just sent in an update. It says that she's decided to go for it. After much hand-wringing and listening and re-listening to the Femsplainer's advice, I made my way to the plastic surgeon. It felt pretty strange to sign up for an expensive and purely aesthetic surgery, but then I tried on the implants and really loved how I looked for the first time before I had nursed my 4 kids. And the delight on my husband's face sealed the deal. This frivolous project is at least not totally selfish if he's so happy. I can report back after it's all done on the results.
Oh, yes, listener, please report back. I just want to make clear, Kai, that we didn't say yay or nay. We talked about the positives and the negatives. So, okay, well, let's hear how it goes. Please report back. And I do like the description of the husband. It's like a Labrador being shown a dog treat or something like, yeah, I'd like that. Yeah. So good for you. All right. Well, we'll hear back.
Fantastic. Congrats. Then another one we got some more boobs feedback. It's from Lana. Lana says, first off, congrats on holding one of the more sophisticated discussions of boobs that I've ever had the pleasure of coming across. That said, I listened with bemusement to your description of breasts and something teenage girls eagerly await. In your telling of it, all girls are aware of and look forward to their associated sexual power with great anticipation. Question for the female audience: was this your experience? I do not think it's universal. Granted, I attended a religious girls' school where all hints of female sexuality were regarded with suspicion and boobs were against the dress code. But I was under the impression that athletes don't always welcome boobs. And for many, they're part of an adolescent awkwardness and a sexuality they don't know how to navigate. As startled as I am to hear myself asking for more discussion of boobs, I would welcome broader perspective on this. Danielle, how do you feel?
I was going to ask you, Kai. I mean, you're much younger than I am. And so maybe what Lana's saying, maybe this is a generational thing. I don't think it is. But do you personally or in your peer group ever thought about that?
I was eagerly awaiting. I think for a lot of girls, it was definitely disappointment when they didn't come early on. So I think it's still something, but I didn't go to a religious girls' school, so it was very different. But yeah, we were still kind of pressed down with dress code. Boobs were definitely not encouraged in my dress code at school either. But I think everyone, still stuffs their bras and does, anything to kind of keep up and look like they're a little bit older.
Right. No, and it's something I don't think should be embarrassed about, it really is part of your development as a woman. It is, as you point out, part of your power as a woman. I mean, what is really disappointing is when they never come in or they take for ages to come in. And I think I looked about 12 till I was 16. And I had a friend called Marilyn, and she looked about 17 when she was 13. And boy, was I miserable. It was like all these boys would join us to eat lunch on the lawn of the school, but they weren't there to talk to me, and they weren't there to talk to her face, to be honest. So
right. Yeah, we had similar experience. Everyone had a Maryland at their school, I think.
Maryland in their life. And you never forget their name either, even, 40 years later. All right. Okay. Thanks, Lana, though. But you're right. I mean, some athletes, for sure, if you're a gymnast, you want to look, I guess, like a muscular skeleton, but I think most women don't.
Yeah, I know. I was actually a fencer in high school. I did fencing for a long time. And we have to wear a specific chest plate if you're a woman fencer, because it's really, really dangerous to get hit repeatedly in the chest with a weapon. And it was definitely something that stood out. A lot of women really hated, having boobs at that point, because it kind of felt like it was a disadvantage. You had to wear more stuff. And, but it depends, I guess. So we also have another one on breasts. So let's keep it going. Trevor in South Africa says, would women prefer for men to be indifferent with regard to their breasts? Not dismissive or derisive, but simply neutral, as if there was nothing special about them. I ask sincerely because it is my impression that a large amount of the unhappiness women express regarding their breasts appears to stem from the near universal appeal they hold amongst men. I suspect that the answer would be no, and that women would initially opt for something in the middle until, that is, it is realized that lukewarm is neither hot nor cold, and not especially suited to the boardroom or the bedroom. I despise lewd behavior and believe that all natural impulses should be harnessed for expression in appropriate contexts. However, it would appear to me that increasingly it is the natural impulses themselves that are branded as toxic. Hence my question, what instinctive reflex would be preferred?
Oh, well, I think, Trevor, what you're saying is you always get mixed messages from women, which is, we don't want you to notice till we want you to notice. And you are just going to have to figure that out telepathically. That a man you are attracted to, you will, of course, want him to notice your figure. And a man you're not attracted to, you'll say, "Ooh, go away. That's so rude." And this is part of the long-standing wonderful mystery between the sexes, Trevor, that you're not supposed to know what we're thinking, or we expect you to guess. And it's completely capricious. And we should just own it. We should just own that we are very capricious about these things.
I agree. I think that's right. I think that's right. Another comment comes in, moving away from the boobs. We've got a comment on the college admissions episode from Ross on Facebook. So he says, there is an issue that seems seldom talked about, but I suspect is part of the problem. That is, maybe the massive emphasis on degrees is contributing to the problem. Too many roles require degrees for degrees' sake, all under the guise of, quote, it teaches you how to think. A medical degree makes sense to go into medicine, and as does a law degree, et cetera, et cetera. But now some roles require a degree just for the sake of it.
Well, Kai, you're the one in the master's program. So what do you think?
I agree with the degrees issue. I think it's definitely, we've kind of come to this point where you have to have a degree to be a bachelor's degree to work at like DSW and sell shoes. So I think there's, we maybe need to slow it down a little bit with the degree pile on. It does get a little bit intense.
Well, I'm someone who actually did not go to college. I went straight into a newspaper when my parents worked at a newspaper in Toronto, and I kind of literally grew up in a newsroom. I started writing for the paper when I was I think my first byline was 9, reviewing children's books.
Wow.
And then by the time I worked there through high school, I worked there through the summers, I worked there in the evenings. And the minute I could work full time there, I seized it. And in retrospect, I have a lot of mixed regrets. And I went back eventually actually to Columbia when we lived in New York to get fill some holes as an adult student where there are things you just cannot teach yourself, whether it's about history or philosophy or political science. But that being said, I think it's absolutely true that given also the insane cost of education now, and not everyone is suited to this. Not every, you shouldn't need, one of the things to talk about is like, what about if you want to become an electrician? Do you really need a BA? Why can't you just go to electrician school and or carpentry or any of these trades that, it is silly that resumes won't be looked at in certain professions without that kind of level of qualification. So I agree totally with this listener.
Yeah, and it's prohibitively expensive too to get an undergraduate. So it really is, it's tough for a lot of students that just otherwise wouldn't have made the choice, but now they feel they have to for the job market.
Do you feel, Kai, that you had to enroll to get in a journalist program to get to work in media?
Yeah. So since I didn't study journalism as undergraduate, I was a nerdy philosophy major. Right. And so since I didn't study journalism, there weren't really, people wanted to see that I had newsroom experience, and you couldn't get newsroom experience without being an intern, and you could get internships without being in a program. Right. So it's really tough. It's definitely kind of forced a lot of, even most of the cohort that I work with, they all studied journalism as an undergraduate, couldn't get any jobs. So now they're in a master's degree program. So it's a difficult field to get into.
Well, I mean, with your philosophy degree, that is important when you want to work in Starbucks, right? Like Starbucks won't even look at your application unless you have a degree in philosophy.
Yeah, that's right. That's how it should be, actually, I think. Our last comment of the month is onto an issue that Danielle had noted at the beginning of an episode. It was reported by the BBC that One Health Trust was deciding not to use the word breastfeeding in favor of now the word chest feeding. And our listener, Margaret, said, I enjoy listening to your podcast and have since it first began. I just want to assuage some of your concerns regarding the gender inclusive language being used in the UK at that One Health Trust. These terms are being used in addition to the women's specific language, not instead of it. As such, it's actually a positive step and not the threat to womanhood some people are presenting it as. Thanks. I just think it's important to get the facts straight, especially on these sensitive topics. That trust is not replacing all women's specific language. I've listened to Femsplainer since it started and have appreciated the perspective as it was balanced.
Oh, thank you, Marwa. Thank you for clarifying. I mean, look, no one wants to get hysterical about small inclusive steps of language, and fine, you're a trans man, but you still have your breasts and you're going to breastfeed, but you want to call it chest feeding. Okay, fine. But we really do have a bigger threat to a lot of women's health. That women when you start denying that women and men are not biologically different from a scientific point of view. I mean, and how all these breakthroughs in women's health, women's specialties, OBGYN, like how do you make that gender neutral? And is it sexist to, specialize in like uteruses? And what we're seeing, and we're seeing this in not just women's health, but as we know, women's sports, we're seeing it that just to be able to make a biological distinction between men and women as needed and necessary without trying to cancel or not acknowledge equality and respect for transgender, you get called a transphobe, you get called a bigot, you get called a TERF, and that's not a conversation. I think it's an important thing to do, is to have this conversation without abuse. So I'm always happy to talk to anyone about it, but I don't want to see the erasure of womanhood or the rights that we have fought so hard for over a century. So that's
absolutely. And I fully agree. I think it's a tough conversation no matter which way you have it, but I think it's a conversation worth having rather than breezing over. So yeah.
Right. And it is amazingly abusive.
It really can be.
I mean, if you say something like I've never seen a group be so angry and vitriolic if you question anything that they say. It's quite amazing. But anyway.
Yeah, I fully agree. And so that's actually the last comment we have for the month. So we'll be back again next month with listener reactions.
Yes. Well, Kai, it's great to have you in the virtual studio. And everybody, I hope, I don't know what a break is in a pandemic, but we're taking a break. And I hope you have a nice break too, Kai.
One. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
See you next time. Femsplainers is a weekly podcast carried on the Ricochet Network and available pretty much on every podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and watch video of our interviews on YouTube. You'll find links to everything, plus how to contact us directly at femsplainers.com. We survive and depend on your support. Like the show? Consider donating as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/femsplainers. And get our exclusive monthly bonus episode, Last Call, in which you get to join the conversation with our guests. And there's much more. And a big shout out of thanks to our audio and video editor, Nat Frum.